Our next speaker, Bryton Barron, is a Rhodes Scholar and former chief of the treaty staff in the State Department. He is the author of 3 well-known books, and I have them right up here with me, and you can get those at the stand out in the halls. Inside the State Department, Dream Becomes a Nightmare, the United Nations Today, and the Untouchable State Department. Mr. Barron has been in the forefront of exposing the un-American activities of our State Department and the communist use of the United Nations. He is a dedicated American patriot, and it gives me great pleasure to present Bryton Barron at this time.
Thank you for your welcome, and thank you, Mr. Moderator, for your kind words of introduction. First off, I want to express my pleasure that Ed Griffin is on the program with me here tonight. I'm not exactly timid in what I have to say about the UN, but we need the vigor and dedication of youth in the fight, as well as the experience of oldsters like myself. Up to 2 months ago, there was not available any full-length analysis of a critical nature of the UN in the light of recent developments, despite the tons of propaganda that have been issued through the years in favor of the UN. Then came my book, to which the moderator has referred, Dream Becomes a Nightmare. And now we have Mr. Griffin's book, The Fearful Master, A Second Look at the United Nations. I have not had a chance as yet to study Mr. Griffin's book, but I have been assured that he has done an excellent research job. Goodness only knows the American people are entitled to and need the true facts. And so I welcome Mr. Griffin as a comrade in arms. I hope with the specifics that he and I have tried to give you in our books, that we may help you, help America, free itself of the UN. Before I say more, I want you to know my wife, who is in the audience. She and I have had many wonderful years together. As some of you who have read the preface of my book on the UN may recall, I mentioned there my indebtedness to her for her alert, wholehearted cooperation on that project, as on many others through the years. Ella, could you stand so they may see you? I also want to say just a word on behalf of Crestwood Books, whom I represent, because of the space which the rally management has provided us, as it has provided so many other organizations and entities, in exhibiting materials here. I think you're all aware of the difficulty which conservative authors encounter in getting their writings published and marketed. And in these days of official propaganda and managed news, it becomes highly important that we learn what on-the-spot anti-communist observers can tell you, as I have attempted to do in my books on the State Department and the UN. We have a book coming out on Vietnam, written by Suzanne Labin, I believe it's called, a brilliant French anti-communist leader. Well, I'm not unaccustomed to the depravity of State Department policy abroad, but I can tell you that when I read this manuscript, I bowed my head in shame. I think you want to know what she has to report at first hand on Vietnam as soon as that book is available. Well, now, let me say that I feel it a very high privilege to meet here with so many outstanding patriots as we rededicate ourselves to the preservation of the American way of life. Possibly because of the publication recently of my book on the UN and my familiarity with that organization as a result of my years in the State Department, I was asked by the chairman of the rally, Colonel Bunker, and let me pause here to express my admiration of the wonderful job he has done as chairman. I was asked to discuss the UN and the menace which it presents. Well, I may be a little rash to presume upon your time on this subject, for so many people feel that they know about the UN after hearing and reading about it for so many years. This is, to some extent, I fear, an attitude among patriots as well as among internationalist socialists. I can almost hear some of you saying to yourselves, "Well, I've heard all I want to know about that ungodly outfit. What more is there to be said?" Well, for one thing, the United States is still a member. And by all that is holy, we had better give thought to it. However, I promise to remember that your ears are perhaps a little weary after 2 days of these meetings, and I try not to talk too long. The subject assigned me might as easily have been the State Department, concerning which I have had a few, to say in the past. For so closely are the UN and the State Department entwined that it is not always easy to determine which is the more at fault, as in that outrageous war on Katanga. Not only does UTHANT make concessions to the enemy for the State Department, at least so he says, but the UN bigwigs also double as political orators for the Democratic Party. Secretary General UTHANT and Undersecretary Ralph Bunche have been making speeches attacking Senator Goldwater, although it is not quite clear by what right these self-styled international civil servants meddle in our domestic political affairs. In the early days of our greatness as a nation, foreign emissaries were sent a-packing if they meddled in our political campaigns. The precedent was unfortunately not maintained when Stalin went all out for FDR. Judging from their recent remarks, UTHANT and his entourage will be most unhappy if Senator Goldwater should become president. I suggest that the only humane thing to do in the circumstances is to let them move the UN, without us of course, to Moscow. There, UTHANT and Bunche and the rest of that communist-infested outfit should feel very much at home. Meanwhile, let us not forget that the United States is not a UN colony. Hands off, Mr. UN Secretary General, hands off. Possibly because I have had first-hand experience myself in the foreign policy field, I always stress the value of such experience in analyzing developments in this area. There would be less justification for this if the full record of the conduct of our foreign policy were open and available to the American people, as I have fought for so many years to make possible. But it is not available. Instead, the record is fragmented, distorted, misrepresented. Let me give you a simple illustration which developed recently. A correspondent in Oklahoma who prided himself on having done research in the field wrote Crestwood books challenging the implication of something I had written. He advised the publisher's research department to secure and give careful study to a copy of the State Department's publication entitled Post-War Foreign Policy Preparation, issued in 1950, which is the official record of the development of the UN Charter, and therefore should be a very useful reference in this connection. Well, I smiled, albeit unhappily, when I read the letter, because I was in the department at the time that publication was being prepared. And I often discussed the project with Harley Notter, a fellow employee charged with the preparation of that record. I recall having lunch with Notter a day or two after Dean Atchison's amazing assertion that he would not turn his back on the convicted perjurer Alger Hiss. Notter had just returned from a trip to Capitol Hill and was boiling mad because someone up there had referred to him, as to Notter, as another of the boys from state who wouldn't turn his back on Hiss. Nevertheless, this State Department publication, this official record, so supposedly, which my Oklahoma correspondent had assumed was authentic, was so distorted when finally released to the public that it appears never to have mentioned in all its mass of details that Alger Hiss had the highly significant role of Secretary General of the San Francisco Conference at which the charter was completed and signed. You can see why I still give priority to what I know about the situation at first hand. But let me tell you a little more to illustrate how private entities combine with the bureaucracy to distort history. While I was working on my book on the UN, a friend suggested that I not overlook a big tome entitled A History of the United Nations Charter by Ruth Russell, published by Brookings Institute, price $10. The fact that it was published by Brookings and authored by a former State Department employee whom I had known should have doubly alerted me against spending the $10. But I didn't want to miss any angles. The first thing I did when I got this big book was to examine the index. And would you believe it? For all those 1,000-odd pages of this history of the Charter, there was not a single reference to one Alger Hiss. Other State Department officials of the day, like Hackworth and Hornbeck and Dunn, were listed, but not Alger. In juxtaposition with this, so you will see how different the actual record really was, let me quote the following from a review of my book by the managing editor of American Opinion, Scott Stanley, brilliant young man that he is, in the June issue of that magazine. Scott wrote, "The new volume," referring to my book, "provides enough ammunition to hurl any liberal into a shrieking fit. How they will howl as we report from Barron's book that our State Department's first efforts to prepare the way for the UN were under the direction of termites like Alger Hiss, Julian Wadley, who confessed to turning over State Department papers to the Reds, and Esther Brunauer, later dismissed as a security risk. They will roll," that's the liberals, "will roll on the ground and tear their hair and moan in cliches from foreign affairs when we inform them that Alger Hiss was executive secretary of their holy Dumbarton Oaks Conference, top State Department authority at Yalta on the proposed UN, and Secretary General of the 1945 San Francisco Conference, at which the UN was approved and signed. And when we quote from Barron's book to the effect that the draft of the protocol to put the UN Charter in force which Barron, as head of the treaty staff at State, had prepared, was ordered by the department to be cleared and revised by Alger Hiss. We are certain that our liberal friends will retire for the evening, nursing black thoughts about right-wing extremists. Can you pass me the glass, please? Thank you. Well, there on the basis of personal knowledge, and in sharp contrast with supposedly authentic reports, is the record set straight for you regarding the role of Alger Hiss in the creation of the UN. When I come before an audience such as this to speak on the subject assigned, and I always welcome the chance to discuss the UN, there is a natural desire to tell you everything I know on the subject, comparable to what I have already mentioned with respect to Alger Hiss. But there are certain very practical considerations preventing my doing so. In the first place, you might not buy my book if I did, and that would be tragic, very tragic for the author's point of view, you know. And the second place, there just isn't time for it. So as an alternative tonight, I propose to supplement my writings with observations formed since the book was published. These observations result in part from a rather heavy flow of letters and comment I have received since the book was published, and they deal with the following questions, 3 in number. A, to what extent does the reception accorded my indictment of the UN, and I speak of my indictment because my colleague's indictment wasn't yet available, same could be said of his. To what extent does the reception accorded my indictment of the UN suggest that the public is ready for a campaign to get the US out of the UN? Second, have I found arguments employed against the UN, employed by well-meaning conservatives, which are not valid? And third, from an analysis of reviews of the book, of letters received, and of audience reactions, what criticisms of the UN would seem to carry the most weight with the average person? I'm going to discuss these 3 points because I thought they would be helpful to you after you leave here and in your own efforts to fight the UN. Well, to proceed with these special observations is to deny myself time enough to engage in an all-out denunciation of the UN. I console myself with the conviction that something more than denunciation is needed, something more than denunciation. Patriots have been denouncing the UN for years. But let's face it, the methods haven't been getting the desired results. The U.S. is today more involved than ever in the support of the UN, financially and otherwise. And in recent months, Senator Goldwater has been almost the only man in public life to speak out in criticism of the UN. Stop and think about that for a minute, if you will. Nevertheless, the facts of the case are on our side. So I say, let's master these facts and use them to open the eyes of fellow Americans blinded by years of UN propaganda. It is a matter of tactics, a matter of approach. First, let us ask ourselves, as we must, to what extent the public is ready and willing to listen. I am personally confident on this score, for wherever I go, I find audiences either skeptical about the UN or openly hostile to it. Of course, I admit that I have never met with groups of the UN diehards, which Adlai Stevenson addresses. But if I may coin, or rather use the phrase coined by Mr. Stevenson, these fanatical defenders of the UN are becoming a shrill minority. Now, the first type of evidence I hesitate to present because it involves reference to my book, and it may sound as though I'm giving the book a plug, which indirectly it may be, but it's the reactions that I've gotten to the book that indicate to me how this line of argument, how effective it will be with our fellow Americans. And the first type of evidence that I want to present is contained in the attitude of hard-headed newspaper men when they write about my book on the UN. Let me quote first from an editorial in the New York Daily News. The newspaper, I was going to say the only newspaper in New York, the newspaper with the largest circulation in America, over 2 million copies of any newspaper in America, daily newspaper. And the tone of this editorial, dated June 8, is encouraging to me as an author, but more to the point here, it shows a readiness on the part of hard-headed newspaper men to face the facts about the UN, which holds out promise to us in the fight which we want to wage against the UN. And so I will quote. That particular editorial was headlined, "Spotlight on the UN." The United Nations, and I'm reading to you now, the United Nations was born in San Francisco, 1945. Most of the world's statesmen and legalists involved were sincere men, imbued with both hope and idealism. Also present were the cynical representatives of Joseph Stalin, semi-sane communist murderer. And for our side, red traitor Alger Hiss. How, after nigh 2 decades, is this ill-begot, notice the phrase, this ill-begot political child doing? And are there any hopes at all of its ever living up to the dreams and prayers of its better founders? A careful, documented study of these questions has been drawn up, and then he refers to my book, and he says, the verdict is gloomy. Despite many warnings, they testify, meaning the authors, myself and W. Jefferson Davis, a constitutional lawyer who has 1 chapter of my book. They testify the UN is still retains in key positions highly suspect operators originally recommended by Alger Hiss and his successors. Their function, to throat-cut the free world and further the cause of the international communist conspiracy by every means available, open or sly. Well, you and I couldn't have said it any better than that. Let me read a little farther to show you that the newspapers, or some of them at least, are ready to get into this fight with us. The West has been able to fight off some of these red attacks on our military posture and our commercial well-being, but that struggle has been against snowballing odds. It is now, the authors believe, almost hopeless. The reason? UN membership has mushroomed wildly with the arrival of African nations. The General Assembly has become chaotic beyond any founder's dream. And I couldn't have done better than that. It is now possible for nations which have only 10% of the world's population and contribute only 5% of the assessed UN budget to wangle a 2/3 voting majority. So you see, we have the ear and the interest and the attention of good newspaper men. Already, the authors note, the United Nations and its subsidiaries have undercut much U.S. commerce, have helped us run a national debt larger than the debts of all the nations in the world combined. UN benefits, even as to world peace, have been puny. Puny is the word. The authors favor our getting out of the UN before it wrecks our nation completely. Right. Even if you don't agree with such a forthright move, here is an expert portrait of the sometimes sacred UN, red warts and all. It is not a pretty picture. Now listen to this. It is not a pretty picture, but it is one to which no responsible citizen anywhere should close his eyes. They'll say the same about your book, too. Now, next, let me quote from an article by Walter Trohan, the able chief of the Chicago Tribune's Washington Bureau, reviewing my book. I do this, as I said, at the risk of appearing to plug my book, because I want you to note the tone of his references to the UN, and bear in mind the facts to which he gives attention. Mr. Trohan's column is regularly syndicated all over America, and he would not be so rash as to write as he did, veteran correspondent that he is, without having reason to feel that many of his readers would welcome it. So I say his review is good tidings. Well, after giving the title, the authorship and so on the book, and describing it as a documented indictment of the UN, so there's no question how he interprets it, Mr. Trohan says, those who are calling for withdrawal with more emotion than reason will find arguments to support their cause. Those who have been led to support and follow the UN blindly can profit from criticism the volume offers. And I'll continue with what he says. You don't need to believe his praise of the book, but I want you to see what he says by using my words, what he is saying about the UN. It is the solemn contention of the authors that the UN is a moral and financial failure, that it is little more than a sounding board for communism. It is also seen as a form of world government which is undermining the American Constitution and will, if given time, do away with American freedom and liberty. These are strong words. Perhaps readers will not agree with them, but they should study them. In other words, he's saying this may come to you as a shock, but think about it. Barron acknowledges that the statesman who drafted the UN Charter had a noble dream in mind, but says the dream has faded into a grotesque and dangerous reality. He contends the UN is not what the planners envisioned, an organization of peace-loving nations dedicated to maintaining security and order throughout the world, but a body meddling in the internal affairs of nations, which was never contemplated by the founders, and doing so in advancing world government. He goes on to say in this commentary on the UN, this Mr. Trohan, the UN has undergone mushrooming expansion with the emergence of African nations. And he uses the same figures that the previous reviewer did. So rapid and unorganized has this growth been that it is possible to obtain a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly. And I feel that these facts make so much of an impression upon these newspaper writers that they should make a similar strong impression upon the uninformed who need to have their ears and eyes opened. So rapid and unorganized has this growth been that it is possible to obtain a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly, which has moved beyond what the founders contemplated in power and purpose of nations which have only 10% of the world's population and contribute only 5% of the assessed budget. The book studies the UN as an alien bureaucracy. I like these words. An alien bureaucracy, an avenue of communist espionage and infiltration, a threat to American national interests, and a menace to business. That's a good sentence. Let me read that again. An alien bureaucracy, an avenue of communist espionage and infiltration, a threat to American national interests, and a menace to business. In the UN, Russia has a voice in issues decisive to American welfare, but refuses to pay its share of UN ventures. The United States has not only the largest share of UN costs, but has been called upon to loan money to the UN, although America's military and economic aid programs are responsible for a $307 billion debt, and that's only part of the picture, as the moderator pointed out, which is larger than the debts of all the other nations in the world combined. Barron contends that the UN is threatening to strip this country of its defenses. He says the UN tied the American hand in Korea, and you know that's true, and in Cuba, as I demonstrate, and at times has forced abdication of national policy. The UN, I want you to listen to this last paragraph, and this is the own words of Walter Trowan. And remember, this is a writer who has a tremendous following around America. So I say this is contrary to the comments that we conservatives have to make to each other. Ordinarily, this is good tidings. The UN was sold to the American people by noble phrases and hypnotizing slogans. It is still regarded as sacred as motherhood. However, it should be examined. It should be examined, and in a critical light. That's a green light to you and me, all right. It should be examined and in a critical light. If it is as bad as the authors say, the people should know it. If it is good, it cannot suffer by examination. Well, Patrick Scanlon, the revered managing editor of the Tablet, took the same editorial position in his column in the Tablet on June 4th. And that's something to remember, because I have personally an intense admiration for Pat Scanlon, because back in the days when I was fighting for the truth for the American people from the records of the State Department, the one editor who was first to speak out on the subject in support of me was Pat Scanlon. Well, the Baptist Bible Tribune of May 22nd ran a big banner headline clear across its front page in big black type: "The UN is a nightmare." So there's another precinct heard from. Exclaimed the editor, "Never in the history of this country has an institution or a thing had behind it such a bulldoze of organized, resourceful, plausible-sounding, fraudulent propaganda as that conglomeration of atheism, communism, and totalitarianism known as the United Nations." It has cynically and systematically tried to brainwash the American people from the kindergarten to the home for the aged and infirm. And it has been incredibly successful. And mostly because it has had and does have as its allies the barren, sterile, not this kind of barren, sterile pulpit, most of the TV and radio, most of the press, all the liberals, and all of the arrogant and proud educational organizations. No such united fanaticism has been seen on earth since the prophets of Baal believed he would send fire from heaven. But, rejoiced this editor, referring to the new book, the United Nations is being brought to trial. Our commentators, other commentators and reviewers have written in a similar vein. Now, earlier indications of the changing temper of the American people with regard to the UN came in the willingness of members of Congress who have served as delegates to the UN Assembly. Now, you may not have been aware of the fact that each year to the General Assembly we have sent from Congress 2 members. 1 year, 2 members of the lower house, another year, 2 senators, one from each, 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. Well, in recent years, these members of Congress who have served through a complete General Assembly of the UN have been speaking in increasingly forthright terms in reporting their observations and conclusions. Well, now here, for example, I want you to listen to these carefully, because these are the words of members of Congress and not of the State Department bureaucracy or the UN Secretariat. These are men and women who were elected by their constituents and were probably had reason to think that what they had to say would not be unwelcome back home. Well, here's from a report in 1962 of two members on returning to Congress after serving at the UN that year. I want you to listen to these words. Quote, "The statesmen who drafted the United Nations Charter had a noble dream. Those who now rely on the United Nations as a cornerstone of our foreign policy are not awake to reality. It can no longer be considered a union of peace-loving nations dedicated to maintaining security and order throughout the world. The pertinent questions, therefore, are these. 1. Can the United Nations, without changing its present composition and present character, ever meet its original goal? 2. Do the policies and activities of the United Nations at this time further the best interests of the United States? 3. Does United States policy in regard to the United Nations strengthen our position in that body and consequently in the world? Those are three good basic questions. And what's the answer? Reluctantly and regretfully, our answer to all three questions is no. No. In the very form and substance of its charter were laid the seeds of futility and eventual frustration. No one can serve as a delegate to the General Assembly. Now here are people speaking from first-hand experience. These are not right-wing extremists. We don't mind being called that, but these are congressmen. No one can serve as a delegate to the General Assembly without feeling the full impact of cross-currents and hostility in its committees and in plenary sessions, and without being aware of the frustrations, limitations, and failures, mind you, of the organization. To fail to bring into focus the dangers involved in its continuation under its present form and circumstances without hope or plan for change, and to fail to issue a caveat thereon would be a failure of our responsibility as congressional delegates. Those who would still have us rely on the United Nations as a major instrument of our foreign policy or as an agency dedicated to keeping the peace are not awake to the facts of life as they are today and probably will be for some time to come. End of quote. Well, there was a time when it would have been rank heresy, even political suicide, for any man in public office to have said such things. There is fresh hope, too, when Senator Goldwater can be critical of the UN and simultaneously tremendously popular at the grassroots of America. Other indications, as from members of Congress, who felt the same way. For example, Representative H.R. Gross is one of three congressmen who wrote me almost immediately. Representative Gross put to his letter to his constituents a reference to this indictment of the UN and told them where they could get it and urged them to read it. That's helping spread the word. Well, now let's turn to the second question I raised, namely, are various criticisms that have been directed at the UN equally valid? You would all be pleased, I am sure, if I were to answer yes. Of course, I'd like to please you. Every speaker likes to please his audience. But here I must demur. Some of the statements made by critics of the UN are not historically accurate. And I believe we need to know this and consider this fact as we go forth to fight for the elimination of the UN from the United States. Now, these statements to which I refer are not basic, and the case against the UN is not dependent upon these somewhat distorted or inadequate statements. Nonetheless, we should purge from our brief against the UN any inaccuracies in the interests of truth, and lest we weaken our case by using them. I left the State Department because of my insistence on historical accuracy. And I must insist on historical accuracy in this matter, even though occasionally it means that I have to drop certain arguments that I'd like to use against the UN. Now, don't get the impression that I'm soft on this subject. I am pretty well experienced in subversive activities. I had Alger Hiss spotted long before any of you people, I hope, ever heard about him, because I had to work with him. A contention in point is the assertion that the creation of the UN was a communist plot. Quite the contrary. The demand for the UN came from American idealists, or shall I call them liberals, like Secretary Cordell Hull, who had been bitterly disappointed by U.S. rejection of the League of Nations in 1920, and therefore jumped at the chance under FDR to use World War II as a pretext for reviving the League of Nations under a different name with the United States as a member. If you think that our own liberals were not the ones that were primarily at fault, if you think Moscow was greatly interested at first, then you have forgotten your history. For at the Moscow Conference in 1943, Moscow proposed only a military item for discussion and left the proposed peace organization completely off the agenda. The UN proposal, advanced by the United States, was only restored after Cordell Hull pleaded with Stalin and Molotov. Cordell Hull related all of this in his memoirs, chapter 93, and the Four Nations Declaration, which they finally came up with at Moscow on October 30th, 1943, which Cordell Hull hailed as the birth of the United Nations, was dictated by the U.S. delegation at Moscow. I might also remind you that on subsequent occasions the Soviet officials blocked negotiations on the Charter, and that these were resumed only in response at the insistence of the United States. One time when the Reds were holding back, Truman threatened to form the UN without them. Too bad he didn't. Too bad he didn't. But no, we had to appease the Reds, and in the process we had to make concessions to them that should never have been made. For many people, let's be frank about it, for many people, the creation of the UN was the fulfillment of a noble dream and an age-old yearning for peace. Let's grant this for the moment, out of courtesy to fellow Americans whose cooperation we will need in rectifying the situation. Few people sensed then that the presence of the communists doomed the organization from the outset. Nobody anticipated that in a few years it would be overwhelmed by delegates from areas that are mere caricatures of nation states. The public little suspected then that the staff, both of original planners and of the subsequent Secretariat, was lousy with subversives. And we were yet to discover the use of the UN as a vehicle for diabolical plots against our national defense. Senator Connolly, whose foresight gave us the reservation which is our bulwark against world court meddling in domestic affairs, nevertheless supported the charter originally. I do not recall that Senator Taft opposed the charter initially, even though before his death he recognized that the UN, in his words, had become a trap, which it is. And those fine patriotic women of the DAR who took the lead later in renouncing the UN when the disastrous trend of affairs became apparent, had originally endorsed the charter. Some of you don't like to be reminded of these things. Well, why not? You want the truth, don't you? You want it, isn't it fair warning against being stung again by the liberals? Stung again as we were with the nuclear test ban trap? If it was a dream, and we'll get farther in this country of ours if we grant that it was, the UN has nonetheless now become a nightmare, an alarming, dangerous reality. Let there be no question on that point, and if your friends and those you're going to approach on the subject have any doubts, show them a copy of Mr. Griffin's book, or if you can't find that, show them one of mine. We have the facts in there for you. Another point of confusion among critics of the UN has been the role of the UN military staff authorized by the Charter. Some have dreamed up all sorts of things that this committee has done. Others have confused it with the Security Council. I hope to, in one or two sentences, to clarify that confusion. The Military Staff Committee was intended to serve the Council, that is the Security Council, in the organization and deployment of military forces which member states would place at the disposal of the UN. Now here's a sentence for you to remember. Fortunately, the high-level military chiefs assigned by various nations to make up this committee became deadlocked. We may be thankful for that. Deadlocked as early as 1948, before the Korean War. And according to my information, that unit has remained inoperative, something of a dead letter. But there's, of course, always the danger of its being revived if disarmament fanatics have their way, to our peril, and all military power is taken from us and concentrated in the UN. Correspondence which I receive reflects public confusion regarding possible revision of the Charter. I've seen quite a bit about that in the newspapers lately. Die-hard defenders of the UN hold forth the hope of correcting the arrangement whereby our enemy, the USSR, was given 3 votes to our 1 in the UN Assembly. The same applies to the voting situation, whereby, as Secretary Rusk has admitted, and as these reviewers have said, a 2/3 majority in the Assembly can be formed by nations with only 10% of the world's population, or who contribute only 5% of the UN budget. Possibility of correcting this intolerable situation is very, very, very slight indeed. The Burleson Church report, and Burleson and Church were 2 congressmen who had had first-hand experience in the UN Assembly, gave us an expert opinion on the subject. And of course their opinion derives from the fact that the Charter requires for revision a vote of 2/3 of the membership and unanimous approval of the permanent members of the Security Council, which include the Soviet Union. And you and I can imagine the Soviet Union giving up its 3 votes to 1 in the Assembly, to our 1. Well, here is what the Congressional report said. Almost since the United Nations Charter was approved by the founding nations, there have been demands for improving and strengthening it. They have all been without fruition. they have all been without fruition. Those who talk about strengthening the United Nations frequently couple their recommendations with an insistence that the veto in the Security Council be eliminated. The United States has never used the veto, but the day may come when we will in order to protect ourselves. That's what they said, I doubt it, from the infringement of our sovereignty. Removal of the veto is not the answer, nor is it as a matter of reality. Listen, nor is it as a matter of reality possible to strengthen the peacemaking capability of the United Nations as long as the communist bloc works to impose its doctrine on the free world. In the face of Soviet attitude, efforts to strengthen the United Nations may well seem destined to remain sterile and devoid of any chance of accomplishment. In other words, if we stay in the UN, the United States will remain thus in the General Assembly, despite its nearly 185 million votes, people entitled to cast as now just one vote, the same as Cyprus and some of the new African countries. If the foregoing were not the case, keep this in mind, if the foregoing were not the case, and if revision of the Charter were readily feasible, which it is not, then we might easily be confronted with amendments completely destroying our sovereignty as a nation. Never lose sight of that for a moment. Either way, the only thing to do is to get out while there is time. In recent weeks, there has been no improvement in the situation. The bankrupt organization is still scrounging for money, begging for donations because other nations don't think enough of the UN to pay their dues. Central Africa faces chaos as a result of U.S. meddling, unless Shumbay, ironically enough, the leader against whom the UN waged war, can save it. The Cyprus adventure has accomplished nothing, even after intervention by the wheeler dealer in the White House. The long UN trade conference finally broke up with the backward nations still demanding that the rest of the world support them through the UN. And now the Security Council, in recent weeks, has voted to study the use of sanctions against South Africa, not because of any threat to peace, but because of a desire to meddle in what is a purely internal issue, the racial one in South Africa. Commented one observer, should the Council impose sanctions on South Africa in these circumstances, the way may be opened for complaints to the Security Council on similar grounds against the treatment of Negroes in the United States and the UN. The United States should disassociate itself from all such goings-on as soon as possible. Having cleared away, I hope, some of the debris that obscures the view, and having taken note of the latest trends, let us now briefly list objections to the UN which make sense, it seems to me, to the average citizen, and which you can, if you will, prove to the hilt. And I number them. I have 9 of them. I could go on with more. 1, and each of these statements you can prove to the hilt. And I suggest that you keep in mind such basic considerations as these and be prepared to prove them, because that's the way we're going to convert more of the American people to opposition to the UN. First, the UN is financially bankrupt. American taxpayers are footing the bill, while freeloaders tell us what we can do. Second, the Asian and African blocs of delegates control the UN. Control the UN. Meanwhile, U.S. efforts to play along with those nations have resulted in votes that have antagonized our NATO allies. Third, the UN Secretariat and Communist bloc missions to the United Nations are havens for red spies and subversives in the United States. Fourth, the UN prevented our country from inflicting a decisive and crushing defeat on the enemy in Korea, which would have put an end to the trouble which now plagues us again, this time in Southeast Asia. Fifth, admission of Red China, despite its having been branded a criminal aggressor by the UN itself, is gaining support. Sixth, interference by U-Thant in the Cuban crisis saved Castro. That's the fact which I demonstrate in my book, who is now spreading communist subversion throughout all Latin America. 7, in the schools and elsewhere in America, the influence of the UN is destructive of patriotism, religious faith, and individual effort, qualities that made America great. 8, machinery of the UN is being exploited to develop all manner of schemes damaging to our national sovereignty as a nation, our economic strength, our national defense, and our way of life. By way of disarmament through the UN, we would be left powerless to resist a UN police force controlled by the dominant elements in that organization, and you know who the dominant elements are. Far from being, this is number 9, far from being an agency of peace, the UN has become an active menace, waging war with tanks and guns in weaker nations, preparatory to meddling in larger nations, yet permitting communist atrocities and aiding and abetting communist expansion. There's much more that I might add, but I wanted to save time for Mr. Griffin. However, before I close, I want to read from a letter which I recently received from a man in Plainville, Connecticut. His is a specific case, a fresh indication of ways in which almost fanatical supporters of the UN in some areas can ride roughshod over the rights of individuals. In these days when we hear a lot about civil rights, ride roughshod over the rights of individuals and subject opposition to vicious attack. Let me read from this letter which I received. This is an ordinary individual, I assume like the rest of us. For several years, our schools in this town have been built into something which is, I'll read further. My 12-year-old son has been bused to the primary unit, which includes those children up to and including the 5th grade. When my son finished the 5th grade, he was bused to another school, still further away from home, with a high proportion of 6th grade. Of this later school, I had read accounts during the last few years of trips to the UN films being shown to the children, UNESCO speakers doing a fine job of brainwashing the parents of their children at PTA meetings, etc. In this school during the past year, the desks have been unscrewed from the floor and rearranged for better viewing of educational TV. Through their TV programs, they learn not the 3 R's, but the 3 D's: disarmament, decolonization, and development. During the summer of 1963, I used to tell my son what to look for if he should be assigned to this school. He did go to this school, and it was not long before we got news of the planned trip to the UN. The children were to bring in the money, a little at a time, for their bus fare and other expenses. I signed a paper to the effect that I did not want my child to go to the UN. If he would, in parentheses, if he would read certain material which I would provide in advance, I would consent to a trip to the UN. In parentheses. There is not much time for reading in today's education. The trip to the UN this year was the best yet. It cost $440 for 4 buses. As there was only one child in the school who did not have parental permission, they took him along regardless. It wouldn't be possible to keep the school open for one small boy, and besides that, there would be no teachers on hand to instruct him. They all went to the UN. There are no lawyers except young brainwashed ones and older ones who are ACLU members or worse. In this town of 14,000, I can find no one who finds my fault with the UN. I worked as a process inspector at a certain factory, and I tried to tell my fellow employees about the work of the disarmament agency. And he went on to say, regarding my latest job, I was fired so fast that I couldn't figure out what happened. I think it was a case when I could not be trusted for security reasons. Now you get the chronology of this in a minute. It all happened during the course of 3 or 4 minutes at the change of shift. I handed the boss my identification badge as he requested. I signed a paper in which I agreed not to reveal any secrets I may have learned. We walked together to the locker room where I opened my locker for the last time in his presence and made under his close observation and handed him the key. Then they escorted me to the gate. I am suspect and broke, and I fear that that's what happened on the day my son went to the UN at no expense to me. You get the timing? That is what happened when he objected to his son going to the UN. And so I say to you in my closing words, with renewed determination, let us leave here resolved to remove the evil influence of the UN from this land we love.